All right, we're now on to our last lecture before the second midterm on the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The reading assignment coming in is the first part of chapter 23, the material on hypothalamus and pituitary. The second part will be read after the second midterm, and that's on the limbic system. The hypothalamus, the definition that I've mentioned so far is think about homeostasis. So hypothalamus homeostasis. It is also the autonomic control center of the brain. So its regulation and control of the autonomic nervous system is in part how it maintains homeostasis. There are different limbs or arms of hypothalamic function to maintain homeostasis, one of these being visceromotor control, and that refers to the role of the hypothalamus as the autonomic nervous system control center. So it receives afferent inputs arriving from the reticular formation and related structures, and also acts as a collection of upper motor neurons for autonomic nervous system function. So it sends information back down to synapse onto preganglionic autonomic neuronal groups. And those are either located in the craniosacral part of the CNS or the thoracolumbar outflow for the sympathetic part. This slide provides an overview of the different ways. There's really three different ways through which the hypothalamus controls and regulates homeostasis. One of these I just mentioned, which is the visceromotor control, which is highlighted in yellow right here. And this is in reference to the hypothalamus acting as an autonomic nervous system control center. So it receives inputs from the brainstem and spinal cord through bundles I'll mention when I do the afferents and efferents, the connections of the hypothalamus at the end of the lecture, from the reticular formation and related structures predominantly. So it receives visceral sensory information from the brainstem and spinal cord. It also acts as a collection of upper motor neurons for autonomic control, which is illustrated here. Efferents exiting the hypothalamus travel down to the brainstem and spinal cord to synapse onto autonomic motor neurons, either parasympathetic or sympathetic, to regulate or orchestrate homeostasis through this visceromotor control. Another way that the hypothalamus controls homeostasis is through humoral control. This refers to hormones. Hormones are low molecular weight molecules that act very much like neurotransmitters, only their actions are over long distances. So these are released into the bloodstream and travel in the bloodstream. And the hypothalamus monitors circulating hormone levels, and then based on that, it can release hormones or transmitters to regulate other glands in the body. And it does that by controlling both lobes really of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is referred to as the master gland of the body. It's part of the endocrine system. The endocrine system orchestrates and coordinates homeostasis by regulating the organs and glands of the body. So that's what the endocrine system does. And the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which is the master endocrine gland of the body. And as the master gland, it can signal to other glands in the body to release their hormones. So this is referred to as the humoral control arm of the hypothalamus. These two forms of regulation by the hypothalamus are largely reflexive. Most of what we have discussed so far to this point in the course have been reflexive behaviors, or autonomic or automatic type of behaviors. The hypothalamus acts as a wonderful transitional structure between automatic or reflexive behaviors or control of functions versus voluntary control, voluntary behaviors. We're getting into this more, I think, interesting aspects of the neuroanatomy course and circuits and the functions of these different circuits, because as we're moving up from this bottom up approach, starting in the spinal cord and working our way up through the brainstem and so on, is that we're reaching the point where of consciousness, awareness of sensory information, awareness of information from various systems, integrating that information and making decisions about outcomes to regulate and control behavior. The third arm of the hypothalamus is a great example of this. And so the hypothalamus can signal to prefrontal cortex to regulate decision making. This is called the somatic control. So there's visceromotor control, humoral control, and somatic motor control. Somatic refers to voluntary. So what the hypothalamus does is it sends strong drives and urges up to our prefrontal cortex for us to act on or choose not to. A great, very basic or primordial example of this is bladder distension, signaling that you have to go to the bathroom. And so initially, there's this dialogue back and forth between the prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus. So initially, this drive or urge to get up and use the bathroom might not be that strong. You can initially feel it, but you might wait. Your prefrontal cortex might tell the hypothalamus, no, I'm in the middle of something, I don't want to get up to pee right now. But over time, these urges become overwhelming, and then a decision is made. The prefrontal cortex is the center for decision making, to act on that very powerful drive or urge in order to maintain homeostasis. So that's one example. You might be able to think of many other examples like this of powerful drives and urges that affect decision making. These are sent as impulses to prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex also processes lots of other information arriving to it, integrates that information, and then determines best outcomes. And that's a big part of decision making. We'll get to that later in the course when we start studying cerebral cortex from the perspective of the prefrontal cortex receiving all of this information. You have seen the hypothalamus in the mid-sagittal view. This is just a bit of review, reminding you of where it is. There's this little dotted line here in red showing you roughly the transition between the thalamus above that line and the hypothalamus below it. Hypo meaning below. It's this small part of the brain that lies below the thalamus. Together, the hypothalamus and the thalamus form the diencephalon, which makes up the lateral wall of the third ventricle. We've gone over this before. So the inferior part of that lateral wall is formed by the hypothalamus, which I'm drawing right here and highlighting in red. So it does extend posteriorly a little bit above the anterior part of the midbrain. So that's a little bit of review. We've also observed parts of the hypothalamus from the inferior view of the brain. And so we're looking down really into this area, which is shown here at the left in a higher magnification. One of the structures you can see is right here, the infundibulum, or stalk. That's the stalk of the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland would be attached to that. When the brain's dissected out, typically the pituitary gland remains behind in the sella turcica, the Turkish saddle, covered by dura. And then just outside of that, I hope you can appreciate a ring of tissue right at the base of the infundibulum right there. That's the median eminence. The median eminence lies at the junction of the hypothalamic nucleus, the arcuate nucleus, and the infundibulum or funnel, the stalk, which connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. Also visible here are these two large nuclei. These are called the mammillary bodies, which are also visible from the mid-sagittal view. There's one on each side. It's a bilateral structure, and I'll go over that circuitry. So from the inferior view of the brain, you can see components, parts of the hypothalamus as well as the infundibulum. There are a number of distinct nuclei in the hypothalamus. I'm going to go over a few important nuclei of the hypothalamus in the next slide. To start off, the hypothalamus is divided into regions along an anterior-posterior axis. And so I wrote on here, this is the rostral or anterior part. One way you can tell is where the optic chiasm is. So you saw the optic chiasm, which is labeled O here on the right, is very anterior, and it's a nice landmark to mark the anterior and most inferior part border of the hypothalamus. And so that's how you can tell what's anterior and what's posterior. These different regions or zones of the hypothalamus starting anteriorly, one is called the preoptic area, which I wrote in right here. It's a small wedge-shaped area that lies just inferior to the anterior commissure, which would be right here. And you can see this very nicely on the right. This A right here is the anterior commissure, and that preoptic area lies just below that. It's wedge-shaped and extends down. It's not shown well on the left, down just above the optic chiasm. It contains medial and lateral nuclei, this preoptic area. So even though it's small, it's quite important. And I'll go over the functions of those distinct nuclei, the medial preoptic nucleus and lateral preoptic nucleus, in the next slide. Behind, posterior to this preoptic area, is the anterior region, which you can see both here on the left, and then it's marked A here on the right. Posterior to the anterior region is what's called the tuberal region. So the tuberal comes from the tube or stalk of the pituitary gland, the infundibulum. So it's that region of the hypothalamus that lies just superior to the infundibulum. And then the most posterior part of the, or zone or region of the hypothalamus is called the posterior region, and it's marked on the right, PO here. So it does extend. It's mostly above the mammillary bodies. You can really see those in the diagram here, these two very large nuclei that you can see from the inferior view, what we looked at in the previous slide. And then it does extend behind that, posterior to that, a little bit above the anterior part of the midbrain. These zones in C are shown in a parasagittal view, and so they do extend laterally into the cerebral hemispheres a little ways. So in addition to this anterior-posterior arrangement or zones, the hypothalamus is also divided into medial and lateral zones, which is best appreciated in D in the coronal section. So D is a close-up of a coronal section showing you these zones. So M, there's this small periventricular area. It's not important. It's labeled PE here. Don't worry about that. It's right adjacent to the third ventricle. But there's these two main zones, the medial zone, which lies medially, and the lateral zone, which lies lateral to the medial zone, separated by the fornix. So the fornix, you can see, lies in between the medial and lateral zones of the hypothalamus. The fornix is a big fiber bundle that you can see suspended from the septum pellucidum. You can see this on the left. That's a little bit of the septum pellucidum. And the F is the fornix. It's a very large fiber bundle that's part of the hippocampal circuitry, and I'll introduce that circuit today. It's called Papez's circuit and is involved in some aspects of drive-related behaviors and memory. Maybe particularly memories with an emotional component. So I'll review that entire circuit today, and we'll look at it again when we do the hippocampus lecture during the limbic system part of the course, which is after that second midterm. Within these zones are distinct nuclei. And so first, in this diagram, I really like this diagram. It's very helpful. It's kind of three-dimensional, the way it's drawn. You can see the large lateral zone, which is lateral to the fornix. So you can see that the fibers of the fornix lie in between the medial and lateral zones. And then some of these key nuclei, or some important, we're not going to go over all of them. There are a number of them. I wanted to highlight a few of the important ones. These are the ones circled in red, which you can see to the right. So these nuclei circled in red, we're going to go over one at a time. Most of these nuclei are part of that medial zone. So you can see, for example, these nuclei here, here, here are all medial to that large lateral zone. The preoptic area, which is labeled PR there, contains medial and lateral zones. The lateral preoptic nucleus is an important sleep promoting area. So this is another great example of a powerful drive or urge. So you may have had powerful drive and urge to sleep sometimes during lecture because you might be tired, but then these urges are sent upwards to your prefrontal cortex to make a decision to act on or not. And so you may not, those drives coming back down for decision making might keep you awake because you don't want to fall asleep during lecture because you might miss something. So that's just another example. The medial preoptic nucleus is a temperature regulation area. So temperature regulation is a great example for homeostasis. It makes sense that it's a nucleus in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus' main overall function is homeostasis. So we must maintain homeostasis of body temperature. And I'll summarize the last slide of lecture today. I'll go over temperature regulation as a great example for the three limbs or mechanisms through which the hypothalamus maintains homeostasis: visceromotor control, humoral control, and somatic motor control of temperature regulation. Another nucleus lies just dorsal or above the optic chiasm. It's aptly named the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So that's right above the optic chiasm and receives crossing fibers from retinal ganglion cells to update the brain's clock, biological clock, which is what the suprachiasmatic nucleus is, regulating circadian rhythms, updating the body's clock with changes in the amount of light during the seasons. So this is done by direct retinal input to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So it makes sense, its location makes sense to be right above the optic chiasm. Then above that, superior to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is the supraoptic nucleus, or SON, right here. And then with an intervening nucleus, the anterior nucleus that we're not going to talk about, is another nucleus, the paraventricular nucleus, PVN. The supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus are grouped together because they perform similar functions. These nuclei produce and secrete the hormones oxytocin and vasopressin. Vasopressin is also called antidiuretic hormone. They're the same thing. What these hormones do, the antidiuretic hormone is more descriptive than vasopressin. It signals the kidneys to retain water, to prevent dehydration. That's what antidiuretic hormone does. Oxytocin is an important hormone for parturition, which is a word that means childbirth. So this hormone is responsible for uterine contraction during childbirth and milk secretion. Both of these nuclei, the PVN and SON, paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus, produce and secrete both of these hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And I'll review that again in an upcoming slide because these nuclei, the PVN and SON, this is how they're nuclei that control the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And I'll summarize that in an upcoming slide. So moving along within the tuberal region, which is posterior to the anterior region, is an important nucleus called the arcuate nucleus, labeled AR here. The arcuate nucleus has two important functions. One is to regulate feeding behavior, and the other is to control the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So it has these two different functions. I'll go over how it controls the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland in an upcoming slide. For feeding behavior, the neurons within the arcuate nucleus are able to freely monitor circulating hormone levels in the blood. And this is made possible by the median eminence. The arcuate nucleus lies just dorsal or superior to the median eminence, which, if you recall, is one of the circumventricular organs. The circumventricular organs lack a blood-brain barrier, and they lack a blood-brain barrier so that they can monitor circulating hormones in the blood. The neurons in the arcuate nucleus do this. The peptide hormones, their levels fluctuate depending on nutrition and glucose levels in the blood. So as those drop, the arcuate nucleus can release hormones into the blood to trigger feeding behavior, and vice versa. So it's a feedback, auto-regulatory feedback system. That's in large part how the hypothalamus maintains homeostasis. The infundibulum lies just below the median eminence. So you can see the infundibulum here, and I kind of drew in where the median eminence would be. So it lies just below the arcuate nucleus. The median eminence contains a capillary bed, which is better shown in a subsequent slide. The last nucleus here that I'd like you to understand are the very large mammillary bodies, which are shown in blue, circled there. The mammillary bodies receive the inputs from the fornix. So the fornix means arch. Lateral to where we are now, if you continue laterally into the screen, you would eventually enter the temporal lobe on the opposite side. The medial temporal lobe is where the hippocampus is located. This is a structure involved in learning and memory. The axons leave the hippocampus from the temporal lobe and wrap all the way around. So they'll imagine from the hippocampus laterally, these axons will wrap all the way around, arc, which is what fornix means, arc around, and they come down. There's this posterior part of the fornix, which lies posterior to the anterior commissure. There's another part we'll look at later. These axons, which you can see separating the medial zone from the lateral zone of the hypothalamus, synapse onto the neurons within the mammillary bodies. So you can really appreciate that in this diagram. Axons from the mammillary bodies then project as the mammillothalamic tract to a nucleus in the thalamus called the anterior nucleus. There are many different nuclei in the thalamus, one of which is the anterior nucleus, which is involved with and associated with the hippocampus, one of the subsystems of the limbic system. And then from the anterior nucleus, it projects to areas of cortex, predominantly the cingulate gyrus, the posterior part of the cingulate gyrus, as well as the parahippocampal gyrus. So this entire circuit is called Pepys' circuit. It goes from the hippocampus, forming the fornix, synapsing on the mammillary bodies, then the mammillothalamic tract projects to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and then back to the posterior parts of the limbic lobe, which include the posterior cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. And then those areas end up projecting back to the hippocampus. It's a loop, this circuit. This is one of the ways, not the main way actually. It's one of the ways through some memories are formed. Memories mainly related to powerful drives and urges, probably memories that have a more emotional component. So next we're going to look at the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is considered the master gland of the body. It's part of the endocrine system. It's divided up into two parts, which can be appreciated here in this T1 weighted MRI. There's the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which has other names. I just wrote them on here so that you're aware of it. The anterior lobe is also called the adenohypophysis or pars distalis. All of these names are used interchangeably. I mainly use anterior lobe because it's easiest. Whereas the posterior lobe is sometimes called the neurohypophysis or pars nervosa. And you can see these two, the reason they look different in the MRI is because the anterior lobe is mainly cellular in nature, whereas the posterior lobe contains fiber tracts, long axons, coming down from the SON and PVN, as well as some vasculature. And so that's why it looks kind of like white matter. And it contains nervous tissue, which is why it's called pars nervosa or the neurohypophysis. In development, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland developed as a downward growth from the diencephalon and is part of the brain. The anterior lobe is part of the endocrine system and developed from the roof of the mouth. So there are these two different parts of the pituitary gland that are controlled differently by the hypothalamus to maintain homeostasis. This is another diagram of the pituitary gland from an atlas called the Gartner and Hyatt's Atlas of Histology, which is a handbook that's often used in medical school that accompanies your slide box, which includes histology from the entire body. This atlas is commonly used, and at the beginning of those histological sections, they often include some diagrams, this being one of them, showing you the pituitary gland and both of its lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. It also illustrates the ways that the hypothalamus controls these lobes. So first of all, I want you to make note that in this example, they flipped it on you. So don't be confused. This is anterior. The reason you can tell is because that's where the optic chiasm is. So don't be confused by that. That means the anterior lobe of the pituitary is this one. And you can see here that the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland contains what are called acidophils and basophils. So here's a little histological review. The basophils stain blue-black because they're basophilic. They stain by hematoxylin. The acidophils stain pink-orange by eosin. They're here. So they're called acidophils and basophils because of how they stain using hematoxylin and eosin. These cells, the acidophils and basophils, secrete most of the hormones by the pituitary gland. So these hormones are beyond the scope of this course, but to give you an idea for what they secrete, there's growth hormone, and then hormones that control release by the other glands of the body. So you can see a lot of these glands here, hence the master gland. The pituitary gland, being the master gland, controls secretion of hormones by the other glands of the body. The way this is controlled is by the arcuate nucleus. The arcuate nucleus would lie right here, above the median eminence, which is a capillary bed. The median eminence is a circumventricular organ. That collection of capillaries lacks a blood-brain barrier so that the arcuate nucleus can freely monitor circulating hormones in the blood. Depending on the levels of those hormones, the arcuate nucleus releasing or inhibiting hormones into the bloodstream, which is then brought down by a portal vein here and then released down to the acidophils and basophils to tell them to inhibit or release their hormones. So that's how that works. You can also see, so here, okay, so they put the arcuate nucleus, I put it right above the median eminence, but it's actually shown right here, and I wrote it, arcuate nucleus, neurosecretory cells secreting, releasing, or inhibitory hormones. So that's what's shown there. For the posterior lobe, the control is by the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, which are shown here. These different cell groups, they have the same function. releasing via these long axons. So these are axons that come all the way down and release directly into vascularized tissue capillary bed located in this area in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And then those hormones enter the bloodstream and are circulated to the body. Oxytocin and vasopressin, aka antidiuretic hormone, ADH, signals the kidneys to retain water. Oxytocin is involved in childbirth, which is called parturition, stimulating uterine contraction and myoepithelial contraction for milk secretion. This is the Nolte textbook version of how the hypothalamus controls both lobes of the pituitary. So it's another summary, really, of what I just said. Now we're back to anterior being here. Here's the optic chiasm. So you know that this is anterior, showing you the anterior lobe, which would be on that side, and then the posterior lobe would be here. For the anterior lobe, you can see the arcuate nucleus lying just above the median eminence. The median eminence is a capillary bed. The axons from the neurons located in the arcuate nucleus can monitor circulating hormones in the blood. Depending on those levels, releasing or inhibiting hormones that are taken down by the portal vein and then released here, communicating to the acidophils and basophils to release their hormones or not. On the other side, you have the PVN and SON releasing oxytocin and vasopressin via these long axons that come all the way down, releasing their hormones directly into the capillary bed located in the posterior lobe, and then entering these hormones, then circulate to their target organs, the kidneys, the breasts, and the uterus. Providing a little summary here of the main connections of the hypothalamus. So first, on this slide, are the afferents arriving, the major inputs to the hypothalamus. These inputs include widespread cortical areas, which are shown here, as well as orbital cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, which is in part involved in some drive-related types of behaviors, some decision-making based on drives and urges. So those are areas that arrive to the hypothalamus. From the retina, this makes sense. You can guess where these are going, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which lies just above the optic chiasm, which you can see right there. The fornix from the hippocampus, this is the fornix, heavily myelinated axons arcing around down to the mammillary bodies. That's an afferent arriving. There are two different pathways interconnecting the amygdala. And so if you went further laterally, the amygdala would be located back here. These two pathways, I don't want you to worry about the names of these. If you happen to remember them, that's fine. I'm not going to test you on these names because the midterm's coming up. But these are called the stria terminalis, or ST, or the ventral amygdalofugal pathway, which is labeled VAP here. Don't worry about the names, but just be aware that the amygdala is heavily interconnected with the hypothalamus, and these are the pathways through which it does that. The hypothalamus, as I mentioned before, receives inputs from the reticular formation and related structures and the spinal cord, where the thoracolumbar outflow is, the sympathetics. So you can see from the brainstem and spinal cord, these fiber pathways are called the medial forebrain bundle, or MFB, and the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, or DLF. So these are bringing this visceral sensory information to the hypothalamus. That's part of how the visceromotor control works. It must receive that visceral sensory information from those areas. The outputs largely reciprocate the inputs. So I mentioned that the hypothalamus can act like a collection of upper motor neurons for autonomics. So the MFB and DLF, medial forebrain bundle, and dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, are bidirectional. So the outputs from the hypothalamus project back down like a collection of upper motor neurons for autonomic control over these other parts of the autonomic nervous system. The stria terminalis and ventral amygdalofugal pathway are bidirectional, and then the outputs to the cortical areas largely reciprocate the inputs. These are summarized on the next slide. On the right here, it's showing you where the DLF is. I don't want you to worry about identifying that. You can see how sparse those axons are. So it's the little darkly stained spots in that area is where the DLF is. I would not ask you to be able to identify that. The outputs are efferents exiting the hypothalamus. As I just mentioned, many of these are reciprocal or bidirectional. The medial forebrain bundle continues rostrally to reciprocate the inputs from cortical areas. So these outputs are going to orbitofrontal cortex and to other widespread cortical areas. You can see outputs to the septal nuclei. We'll go over this more later. These are cholinergic connections to and from the hypothalamus. Outputs, a couple of outputs for regulation of the pituitary gland. You can see the PVN and SON supraoptic nuclei and paraventricular nuclei controlling the neurohypophysis, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and then the arcuate nucleus projecting down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to regulate the cell's secretion by basophils and acidophils of their hormones. Mammillary bodies, mammillothalamic tract is shown nicely here, going to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. There is some descending output. I don't want you to worry too much about that. That's largely, some of those go to the periaqueductal gray there and are actually responsible for downward behavioral outputs for emotion. I'm not going to talk much about that. And then, of course, the MFB, which is not written in here, it's the medial forebrain bundle, and the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus are reciprocal. So those are both afferent to the hypothalamus and efferent exiting the hypothalamus. And again, the stria terminalis, ventromygdofugal pathway are bidirectional, interconnecting the hypothalamus with the amygdala. So there are very strong connections, as you can see, with the homeostasis control system, with the emotional center of the brain, which is the amygdala. Last, I wanted to use the medial preoptic nucleus or medial preoptic area as a nice example for how the hypothalamus controls homeostasis. The three limbs of hypothalamic control of homeostasis are shown very nicely on here. So this is an example of the body's response to cold. So there's a decrease in temperature. Cold skin receptors can detect that decrease in temperature and signal that to the hypothalamus and here to your awareness. Certainly you're aware of that information. Then there's a thermostat, maintenance of core body temperature. There's a thermostat, body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. And then one of these limbs is the visceromotor control, the hypothalamic control of the sympathetic nervous system. So these would descend down to the brainstem and spinal cord as these upper motor neurons to control, in this case, the sympathetic nervous system. So the main targets here would be in the spinal cord, the IL cell column, resulting in this visceromotor response. One of these is piloerection, which refers to your hair standing on end to help retain body heat. Skin vasoconstriction, so closing up the capillaries to the surface of the body in an effort to maintain core body temperature. Signaling the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine to increase basal metabolic rate. So these are a few ways through which the visceromotor control by the hypothalamus regulates core body temperature. There's the humoral control, which refers to hormones. The hypothalamus, via the arcuate nucleus can releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, to the cells within the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which release thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid gland is a gland that's involved with metabolic rate and controlling metabolic rate. So the thyroid then releases its hormones to increase basal metabolic rate in an effort to maintain core body temperature. Shivering, this is really an autonomic response to being cold. So this is really more part of the visceral motor control. This is involuntary, and what this does is it's muscular contraction and shivering, which burns energy to increase the body temperature. And then last is the somatic motor control, which gets into behavior, these powerful drives and urges that are sent to cerebral cortex, really the decision-making area, the prefrontal cortex. There's a limbic lobe, which is a bridge in between these connections, but the main point is that the hypothalamus can signal these strong drives and urges with the limbic system kind of lying in between to the decision-making area, the prefrontal cortex, which can lead to voluntary responses. And these voluntary responses would include putting on more clothes to stay warm, curling up into a ball to maintain, in an effort to maintain core body temperature, increasing muscular activity, so doing jumping jacks or something to maintain body temperature, eating, certainly food burning calories when the metabolic rate increases would be a way. Staying warm requires calories to maintain that body temperature. And then last, maybe snuggling up next to the fire. When I see this voluntary responses, I don't know if any of you have watched the show Naked and Afraid. In this show, these contestants are put out into an area of the world that's very harsh and asked to survive on their own for 21 days. And they're often freezing. The temperatures at night get very cold. And so you can really see all of this happening. They're really fighting hypothermia a lot of the time. And when I look at this, I'm reminded of that show and their efforts. A big part of their burning calories is just trying to stay warm. And what they have to do, a major part is building a shelter and building a fire and doing these things in an effort to maintain body temperature. So this provides a nice summary example involving the medial preoptic nucleus, the temperature regulation area, for hypothalamic control or regulation of homeostasis. So that's it for lecture today. It's a somewhat shorter lecture, and which might be good just before the second midterm. And I wish you all luck studying and good luck on the second midterm.